Hi, we're just going to wait one more minute and get rolling. So it's 1:01, so we'll get started on our presentation. So thanks everyone for joining us today. My name is Christopher Dipple, and I, in combination with my colleague Vanessa Kingston, will be walking you through today's session on AODA compliance for your website. A couple of housekeeping points just before we get started. Today's session is being recorded, so we'll send out a copy of the recording right afterwards. So no need for people to go crazy taking notes. And then the other thing, of course, is that we know that there are a lot of questions about AODA compliance. And we'll get through some of them at the end of this, undoubtedly, but feel free to, after the fact, you can send us an email if you have additional questions, but there also will be some time at the end of this presentation to answer some of your questions. So if you do have any, please go ahead and submit them in the chat function, and we'll see how many we can get through. So as I mentioned at the outset, I'll be leading today's session. I'm the president of COP Marketing and Communications. My main area of expertise is digital marketing strategy. I've been at it for quite a while. So I'm going to speak about some of the kind of more basic elements of AODA compliance for your website, and then I'll pass the baton to Vanessa, who's going to dig into some of the stuff that's a little bit more complex. So Vanessa is part of our digital team and works with a pretty broad range of clients on this and other elements of digital and social strategy. So maybe we'll just flip to the agenda. I guess before we get rolling as well, I should just, for those of you that don't know a lot about us, right, what we do. So we're a digital marketing agency based out of Kitchener-Waterloo. A big part of what we do is really graphic design and development work. So we do a ton of website development. So obviously, some of the stuff around AODA has been, on the radar for us for quite some time, but it's becoming obviously a much bigger issue as the deadline for AODA compliance starts to approach fairly quickly. So without further ado, I guess in terms of the agenda itself, you can see we're going to start with, what accessibility is and why it matters. We'll talk a little bit about the Ontario government legislation that is happening on this. Then we'll talk about the principles of accessibility very briefly, and then we'll dig in quite a bit of detail into the practical elements, some of the principles and rules that everybody needs to adhere to in order to be AODA compliant for their site. So to start with, what is accessibility? So accessibility is the extent to which as many people as possible can effectively use a product, service, device, etc. So it's enabling people, in this case, to access your website, regardless of any kind of impairment they might have. Somebody that's maybe hard of hearing or has trouble seeing, might be somebody with cognitive disability of some kind. Regardless of what that disability is, this is really about making it so that they can access your website and that they can understand everything that's on your website. And I think the interesting point here is just to start by saying that, clearly, we've all been hearing about AODA for many years, but a lot of focus has been kind of more on the physical accessibility. You think of organizations that put, ramps to ensure wheelchair accessibility or elevators, that kind of thing. So a lot of that kind of physical accessibility associated with AODA has been really the focus, and now more than ever, it's that digital and online accessibility that's becoming part of the equation. So in terms of why does it matter, other than it's obviously the right thing to do, right? I mean, it's obviously, you want as many people as possible to be able to not only access your website, but understand the content that's on your website. 6.3 million Canadians and 2.6 million people in Ontario have some kind of disability, and you might think as well, like over the course of each of our lifetimes, a high percentage of us will have some level of disability. Think as you age, for example, and you might have trouble with your eyesight, hearing, etc. Right? So it's a pretty broad spectrum of folks that are going to struggle with some kind of a disability over the course of their lifetimes. And so, clearly not only is it the right thing to do, but it makes economic sense even, right? If you're a for-profit business or even a not-for-profit, right? It's pretty critical that your website be something that people can use effectively. And frankly, if it isn't, the probability of them switching to another site that is more user-friendly for them is extremely high. 80% of internet customers with impairments will focus on sites that are easier to navigate and understand. And to be honest, the thing that surprises me in that statistic is almost that 20% don't. But if you think about it in real terms, it matters. It matters a great deal. In terms of Ontario legislation around accessibility, AODA is Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. It's actually been around for quite a while, right? As I'd mentioned, since around 2005, covers a pretty wide range of initiatives. Basically, AODA is a law that mandates organizations follow a bunch of standards, and it's really been brought in with the view to Ontario becoming fully accessible by 2025. That's the goal. So the government of Ontario has a number of steps as part of kind of this roadmap that are geared towards achieving that goal. From a web standpoint, what you're going to hear a little bit about today is really about something called WCAG, that's WCAG 2.0, which is an internationally accepted set of standards that are developed by the World Wide Web Consortium, which is an international team of experts. So basically, the government of Ontario, as part of AODA, has said that all of the sites that we're going to talk about need to comply with the WCAG 2.0 standards that are global standards. I'll complicate it a little bit further by saying that WCAG has 3 levels of accessibility. There's level A, AA, and AAA. And as you can imagine, these are just different kind of grades of sophistication towards kind of the pinnacle of accessibility, right? And level A came in a number of years ago. Most sites more or less do comply with level A. It's some fairly basic requirements, but level AA, which is what we're talking about today, is a whole new ballgame. It's really stepping it up quite a bit from the A level, and to be honest with you, I think I don't know what the latest numbers are, but it's a fairly small percentage of Ontario-based websites that are in compliance as of today. So in terms of the legislation itself, websites need to be compliant by January 1st, 2021. So you basically got about 6 or 7 months to comply. And who we're really talking about is Ontario-based organizations that have 50 or more people. You know, I think it's good practice for smaller organizations as well, frankly, to try to comply with the legislation, again, because I think it's the right thing to do. But in terms of the mandate from the Ontario government, I think those that maybe should be a bit more concerned in terms of penalties and that kind of thing are organizations with 50 or more people. And you will have seen it hit the news a little bit lately, in spite of, you know, like obviously, you know, with COVID going on, there's a lot of kind of news is focused on, you know, some bigger issues. But, you know, there've been a number of articles in the Globe and Mail, et cetera, recently that are talking about this, and I'm happy to fire a couple of those to the attendees afterwards if you want to dig into this in some additional detail. So I guess let's kind of dig into the details for a few minutes here. So there are really four principles of accessibility, right? And this is what we're going to go through today. You know, I'll go through the first principle, you know, perceivability, which is kind of the easy one, and then leave it to Vanessa to go into the tougher, more complex ones, which are the kind of the following three. So perceivable. So in terms of you know, at a basic level, perceivable is information and user interface components have to be presentable to users in ways that they can perceive. So I appreciate that on its own is a little hard to understand, but let me dig into some of the specifics of it. So first and foremost, this is for sure the best known rule that, you know, some sites or a lot of sites already are there on this level. All right, this is providing text alternatives to non-text content. So in essence, what we're talking about here is, you know, any imagery that you've got on your website, you have to have text alternative behind the imagery, and not just text. It can't be just the same text everywhere. It has to be descriptive text that's meaningful, that actually explains what the image is. So, you know, in this example, you know, there's a photo of a site and a caption in their WordPress media library that says, you know, chocolate chip cookies and a glass of milk. And the reason for this is, if you think of, for example, people that are visually impaired, that might be using a assistive reading technology of some kind, that way the reader can actually identify and read out to the person what it is that's appearing on the screen, right? This rule not only applies to websites, it also actually applies to PDFs. So a lot of you have, you know, tons and tons of PDFs on your website, and we can speak about that a little bit later, but it's not just about your website per se. A lot of these things do apply to other digital elements like PDFs. So if you have a PDF with a bunch of photos in the PDF, you do need to have text behind the scenes such that a reader can identify and go through that. So the next one, providing alternatives for time-based media. What this is really about is, you know, it's another fairly basic rule. I mean, you'll have increasingly seen already people using captioning, for example, for videos. And that has been around for a little while. But where things are going with AA compliance is that you essentially are not only going to have to require or have that and or transcripts available for video content, but as well, it will also be for live feed stuff. So things like this webinar, for example, will be the type of thing that will have to have a running caption happen as we do this webinar in a fairly short period of time, right? So in this case, you know, here's an example of a Ron Finley masterclass that's using closed captioning, you know, and again, if you think of the reason for this, obviously, I mean, it's fairly intuitive. I mean, this is for folks that are maybe hearing impaired, right? They need to be able to see on the screen what's happening. In YouTube, actually, and a number of other video related tools, does have some functionality that will enable this. It's not the most complex thing to to implement. It's more just a matter of making sure that you don't forget to do so. The next slide is really, focusing on what I had already kind of alluded to a little bit, right? Under AA compliance, as of January, you'll need to have live captioning, right? So, if you're having a session, whether it's a webinar, that kind of thing, you literally are going to have to make sure that the words are appearing on the screen. There can be a slight delay, of course, and there are a number of ways of doing it. But nonetheless, you'll have to have that live captioning in place at that point. And there are a number of tools and organizations as well that have really popped up in the last couple of months in particular that focus on this kind of thing. It's just really, as much as anything, it's a matter of kind of organizing yourself such that, when the time comes, you can kind of flip the switch and start proceeding in that direction. So next slide, is really talking about creating content that can be used in different ways without losing structure. So, in this example, basically what we're talking about here is the sequence of things, right? So having meaningful sequence and correct reading sequence so that, it can be programmatically determined, right? So in other words, instructions to understand the content can't rely only on sensory characteristics like shapes and sounds and positioning and size. It has to be organized in such a way that a reader knows the order of things, right? So in this case, you can see the example here, right? Any kind of assistive technology needs to be able to sit there and go, okay, I understand what the order of how I should be reading this out to someone is. So if you think of like complicated designs, for example, where you might have, something where, say, somebody has to follow kind of a red line or something like that to find the proper sequence, that would be something that an assistive device would have a very tough time doing. And as such, it would not be compliant. So there's some design elements associated with that as well. Moving along, the next one, I guess, is really talking about making it easier for users to hear and see content. So if you think of in the context of things like color can't be used as the only way to convey information, right? So you can't say things like click on the red button to advance, right? That would be an example of something that wouldn't work, because again, if somebody doesn't, maybe somebody's colorblind, they don't know which button is red. So, and that's maybe a simple example, but it kind of paints a bit of a picture for you of what we're talking about. So there has to be as well a mechanism that enables somebody to pause, stop, or control the volume of audio content. So, in that case, if you think of things like, you're playing a video, if you're not able to stop it or slow it down in any way, right? So we all process information differently. We process information at different speeds as well, right? And so having that ability to kind of control the pace at which somebody has to consume the content is also an important function. The example that's here is really just one from Facebook, right? The video automatically plays when somebody scrolls to that area of the page, but there is a pause and a stop button, that they can use as needed. Next one is making it easier for users to see and hear content as well. This is really about color contrast, which you probably have heard quite a bit about. And this I find interesting because it's a really good example of, this is not all about pure programming, right? Like a lot of these rules, there's big design elements associated with it as well. So when you have somebody, say designing a new website or whatever, it's really important that they understand this kind of thing. Color contrast, if you think of, a designer might come up with a really funky, cool design, but if it might look great to you, right? But if the words themselves don't stand out sufficiently against the backdrop, it may be very, very difficult for someone else to actually make sense of what's on the page, right? So it's a bit of a combination of the size of font, for example, along with the contrast that affects somebody's ability to consume content. So there is a kind of a continuum that you have to follow, that really is a combination of those two factors, kind of the size of font and also the amount of contrast with the background. And those of you that are in the design kind of space will know kind of what 4 to 5 to 1 means in terms of the contrast ratio in that respect. So I think that's another interesting point, really from a purely a design kind of a standpoint. And then the last one I'm just going to chat about quickly is really about the size of text, right? So the size of text that you're using, you have to be able to resize your text on your site by 200% really easily, again, in order to follow the rules, right? So, in this example, we've got a, LCBO site, which is really, really good for this. I mean, as you can well imagine, a lot of the government-related organizations are kind of cutting edge in terms of AODA compliance and WCAG compliance. It's many of them have been kind of planning and working on this for a number of years, right? So a lot of the best practice examples come from those sites. But nonetheless, in this case, you're able to really magnify that content a great deal, and so that somebody again can see it, even though they may have some trouble seeing in general. So that's kind of the kind of more basic stuff. So now I'll just pass it over to Vanessa, and she's going to talk about operability as the next step.
Perfect. Thanks, Chris. Just want to double check. Can everyone hear me? Chris, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Perfect. Wasn't too sure. I guess I've been quiet for the first bit of this, but the next couple of sections are a little bit more complicated principles of accessibility. So let's just jump into it. So operable is another principle, and it says that the interface components in navigation must be usable. So basically, to sum that one up, it's just saying your website should be easy to use through navigation and what's available for the person to get the information. So one of the major points here is making all functionality be available from a keyboard. So for someone that has motor impairment and maybe can't hold the mouse properly, having the functionality through a keyboard is important so that they can actually see through the site. So this is just an example of like a Windows keyboard, but it also applies to Mac. There are buttons that will take someone through a web page. So the most common example is if you are on a website and you press the tab button, it should be jumping through the links through the main menu and the links that are on the page. So that's something kind of fun to test out on your own website and through whatever websites you're visiting, just to see if the tab function works. And that's usually a good indicator if they are following this rule of compliance. But it is something that is achievable through programming and changes to your basic website function. Another important thing is to give users enough time to read content. So I think, as we said before, everyone consumes information at a much different pace. So it's important to let people have some adjustable timing for their web pages. So for example, if there is a timed page for something like a job application, a lot of companies have this where if you're filling out a questionnaire, you have like 30 minutes or so to fill it out. So if there is that time limit, there should be a way for the user to adjust that time limit and give them extra time. So the most common way to do that is give a 20-second warning box that says your session is about to time out. Would you like to extend it? That's the most common one. There are a few places where this won't apply at all. So if you're releasing tickets for an event, like Ticketmaster and Hamilton, which was that super popular play that people waited online for hours to get those tickets. If you were to get those tickets and hold on to them and keep hitting that refresh button to give you more time to fill out your information, it wouldn't be fair to other people. So the way for that is to have people fill in their information beforehand and save it to an account. So that way, when they are filling out a form, it can auto pull some of that information and they have a little bit more time to fill it out. So that way it is fair for everyone. So another common example of giving users enough time to read content is with website banners or any moving, blinking, scrolling, or updating information that's on your site. I did choose a banner here just because it is common for a lot of websites. So the banner usually has 5 or 6 that scroll through, but the important part here is to give people the option to pause that banner, and it gives them a little bit more time to read. So here, the example is the McDonald's banner. I've clearly been on the website a little bit too often over the past few months, but it gives someone a little bit more time to know that, hey, McDonald's is making their menu a little bit simpler, and there is a little learn more button if they want to click it. So the other part to this is making sure that you're not designing your content in a way that's known to cause seizures. Anything that flashes at more than 3 frames per second is known to cause seizures. So when you're creating movement on your site, just make sure it's slow enough that it doesn't trigger off a seizure. And this is more something that designers would be a little bit more aware of, but it is something that you would want to keep in mind if you're just creating content and you're a content creator for your marketing team. So another important part for operability is providing users ways to navigate and find content wherever they are on your site. This is the Toys R Us website as I pulled for an example. And as you'll see, one of the main mechanisms on this page is a bypass block. So it lets you skip to the main content. So the way to activate the block is you press tab and it brings up the skip to main content button. And that just allows people to bypass the first chunk of information that is on the screen that tends to be similar across the entire website. Just makes it easier for them to jump into the information that they need. Something similar to what we talked about earlier with alt tags, web pages also need title tags. And those are the things that appear kind of in the top of your browser that just says what the web page is about. Same thing, it pulls it up in Google. If you're looking through the search engine, it'll usually say the title of your page, which is also really great for search engine optimization. It lets people know what your content's about and it gets the message across. Generally speaking, whatever information you also include on the site should be consistent with the meaning of the page. So try not to confuse people by putting different chunks of information that don't necessarily relate to each other on a page. Keep it simple, keep it straightforward. And the last point there is just about links. A common practice is for links to say something like, click here to learn more, which would have passed compliance standards a few years back. But going into the new year, when you have a link, you need to be descriptive with the link text to say where that link is taking someone. So something like a clothing company website would have something like a link that says, see our sizing charts here. And that gives the user enough information to know that the sizing chart, they'll be directed over to the sizing charts if they click that button. So again, going into some more depth on this, one of the important things is to also have multiple ways for people to locate a web page on your website. So the most common example of that is having a search bar. Search bars are pretty common. Someone searches whatever they need and it pulls information from the whole website that matches that query. Heading tags and labels are also important. It kind of is similar to title tags and alt text, but they give a little bit more context to what's going on the page, and especially true for forms. The label on a form, for example, might say email above the field that someone needs to fill their email into. And again, it just provides the context so people know what they're doing and can clearly navigate through your information. one of the less common things that people might be aware of is focus visible. And this is having a little highlight or an indicator around a box that someone is clicking on. So if you've ever filled in a form and you've clicked on a box and you've maybe been distracted for a few seconds and you come back and you're not really sure where you left off on the form, having something like focus visible gives you a little like a blue line or whatever color line you need around a box, and it lets you know where you've left off, which is extremely important for people that learn at different paces. So the next principle is understandable. So information and the operation of the interface must be understandable. So I'll go through a few examples of this. So language is a really huge part when it comes to having readable and understandable context. It goes a little bit in depth on the programming side. So typically a web page will default to English, depending on how you built it. But there are also options where you can switch out the language to French, which is really important for some of the government sites and bilingual sites. And that's something that's typically written into the code by a programmer. Some WordPress sites have it already built in where you can switch between that function and it'll write it in for you. But it is something to be aware of. The other thing is being able to have your programmer create programming so that if there isn't a separate language on that page, like French, that a audio or assistive device would be able to translate the pronunciation so that it makes sense in that other language as well. So again, it's a little bit more in depth to what a programmer would need to do, but something to be aware of when you are creating a multiple language site. And pulling this example here is just Facebook. Facebook obviously operates around the globe, multiple languages. So in the back end of a Facebook programmer, they would have different codes so that it says what language to pull based on the user's preferences. So the next part of this principle is making web pages appear and operate in predictable ways. The most important part about this is making sure that you're not disorienting the viewer with page movement and unnecessary changes. So the example here is the IKEA website. So if a user is pulling up the menu and they want to search through some of the menu options before they click, there should be a focus indicator that goes around the option. And this again can be activated through tabbing through the site. You'll see it pop up. And this just lets the user know, like, hey, you're on this section, and if you want to click forward and go through to that page, you can click enter. And it just gives a little bit more context so that they know what they're about to do, and they're not confused when the page changes to office chairs in this example. Something similar to on focus is on input. Again, it's making sure that your user is not confused by the context, and they're aware that something is about to change if they hit a certain button. So this one I just pulled from our website this was our webinar sign up. If someone was to hover over the submit button would say, there's a little pop-up box that would say submit. So that way the person knows that if they do want to submit the form, it will take them to a separate page, so they're not confused on what happens next. Navigation is also an important part about making sure that pages appear and operate predictable ways. So typically with a website, your navigation bar stays the same throughout the duration of however long you keep up that iteration of your website. Something like Walmart, across the top you see the deals, the summer sale, outdoor living, toys. Like a couple of those might change out depending on the season, like summer sale, but typically the parts where it's like deals, toys, electronics, clothing will always stay the same on every single page for an extended amount of time. So that just creates some familiarity for the user. Consistent identification is similar as well. Something like the search bar, that is something that has the same function across any page on the website. And it's always identified by a little blue box with magnifying glass. And the text in the search bar says, what are you looking for? So whether you're on the home page or you're on a separate page, it's always going to say that. It's never going to say, oh, how can I help you? Or, hey, what do you need? It's always going to say, what are you looking for? So again, just creates the familiarity and continuity of the content, no matter where a user is on the website. So input assistance is another key area here. So this helps to avoid any mistakes that a user might make when filling in forms. Error identification is a big part here. So if someone's inputting and the program can pull out that there is an error, the error was described to the user in text form. So in this example here, it's a little promo code for a clothing site. Someone enters in the wrong code and you get a little text box that says, this code doesn't match an active promotion, try again. So just lets the user know that something's wrong with what they've filled in. Labels and instructions are similar, except these are more so to prompt people to know what information to fill in. So a really common example is date of birth. And now depending on if you're using a US-based website or a Canada-based website, that date and month might flip, which is a little bit confusing if you don't have the prompt that tells you where you're supposed to put the month and where you're supposed to put the date. So having those prompts for people is really helpful so that they know exactly what information is needed where. And this goes into a little bit more depth. This is something that will be in more focus given the new level A standards, is error suggestions. So it builds on to what we had talked about in the previous slide. But in this example, if someone was to put in their email, not only is it going to say, hey, there's a little mistake here by highlighting a red box and saying that the form has errors, but it's also going to detect what the issue is and how a user can fix it. So in this example, it says, please enter a correct email. Sometimes it'll say, please enter with an email provider, and it says like a little @ symbol, and it gives the example of like Gmail or Rogers. So that's just a good way to prompt people to fix it. Another area where this is really important is when it comes to legal and financial data, or even job applications, claims, those types of things. So if someone is filling in their information, there should be a stage where a person can either reverse their submission, or on the submission side, someone checks over the data and gets someone the opportunity to correct it, or they should have a mechanism for being able to review the information before finalizing. And that last one there is the most common way people do it. So they'll go through, fill out all the information, and there's a final section that says review. So that gives the person a chance to take a look over everything that they filled in so far before they hit the submit button, and it gives them the opportunity to make those changes. And if you've ever filled out anything for the government and you ever panic that you might have filled something in wrong and that they're going to come after you, that's why that is important. So the last principle that we're going to briefly talk about is robust. So this says that content must be robust enough that it can be interpreted by a variety of user agents, including assistive technologies. So that's things like readers, some color adapting technology, things like that. And we're not going to go into too much depth because this one definitely goes into more of the programming side of things. But the point of this rule is to maximize compatibility with future and current agents. So things like parsing and name role values, those are things within the programmatic markups that actually enable a user to use their assistive technology to understand the information. So from a programming point of view, Some would need to make sure that the code is clean, that it doesn't slow down the website use, and that it actually will interact with assistive technology so that if a user needs it, it is there to use and they won't be held back. Again, a little bit more in depth, more than we can talk about. This is more of a programming area. So it is kind of important to have a programmer also look over some of your code just to make sure that your website is clean.
So that's about it in terms of the main rules. I mean, the joy of WCAG, I guess, is that it actually goes into so much depth. We probably could go on forever, but this covers it at a fairly high level. So we'll just pause for a couple of minutes and just see if anybody has any questions. We have a couple of questions already, but anybody that would like to ask any questions, feel free to send them in the chat. I guess the first question is really just about, says, I understand there are automated checkers out there that can help identify some of the challenges on our site. Are there any that you would recommend? So Vanessa, do you want to maybe take that one?
Sure. So on the Government of Ontario's website, there is a couple of resources that go over WCAG and how to check your website compliance. The main one that the government recommends is called AChecker. I think it's just achecker.com. We can also send out a link as a follow-up to this, but you throw your website URL into that and it'll pull up a list of where you're compliant and where you might need some extra help. There's also AChecker, or sorry, not AChecker, Wave. Similar tool to AChecker, and it pulls up a list of what might be wrong, areas that you should take a look at. So those are two really good places to start just to get a feel of where your website's currently at.
I might add to that, I guess, that there are also checkers. So if I think of there are color contrast checkers out there that focus, specifically on that as well, where you can kind of take a look at your screen and it'll make that call as to whether or not there's some kind of problem in terms of the color contrast. So there are a lot of these automated tools out there, but I agree, AChecker is probably the place to start. And maybe the one caution I would have is just that the automated tools are good, but it's probably a good idea as well to have somebody that has a bit of an understanding of this stuff take a look at the results. Because some of the elements, the automated checkers aren't going to pick, right? So, an example of that might be, a lot of people might have non-descriptive text in terms of their alternative text, and the automated checkers aren't going to pick that up. They'll pick up that, there's no, or that there is or is not text, but they won't pick up whether or not it's kind of the right text for that image. And there's some elements of judgment that go into that. Another question, to what extent do all of these rules apply to other online content, PDFs? Vanessa, you want to jump in on that one?
Yep. So in terms of anything that really lives on your website should be compliant to WCAG 2.0 level AA standards, sorry. And that does include PDFs. So within PDFs, Chris briefly mentioned this before, but there is things like title tags and alt text that you do need to be aware about, as well as reading orders. So something like Adobe Acrobat is a good place to go through and double check if your PDFs are actually accessible. There is technology on there it'll read out your PDF to you, which is a really great way to understand if someone who is using assistive technology can understand what your PDF is saying. Sorry, I forget what the rest of the question was, Chris.
No, they're just asking about primarily PDFs by the looks of it, in terms of to what extent different elements of this apply to PDFs. But it's, I think the answer is that there are a number of elements, right? I mean, I think obviously the text requirements are there. some of the kind of sequence requirements exist for those as well. So it's important on a number of fronts. Another question, I guess, is around AAA compliance. So when is it worth it to focus on AAA compliance instead of AA at this point? So yeah, at the outset, I mentioned that, WCAG, there are 3 levels: single A, AA, AAA, right? And right now there isn't a timeline that has been set for AAA compliance. I'm assuming eventually that will happen. I'm not sure that there's anywhere in North America where AAA compliance is kind of quite yet on the radar. So I suspect it's going to be, at least 3 or 4 years before that would happen, right? But I assume that's where it will be eventually, and that is a whole other set of rules. So I think my thought on that would just be, there's a difference between if you have an existing website where you're like, listen, I want to make sure that, we're on par with where everyone's at by the end of the year. I think that achieving AA compliance is going to be a lot more easily done with an existing site. If you're doing a complete site rebuild, that's where you're scrapping your existing website and you're doing something from scratch. It might be worth taking a look at AAA, because you may well be thinking, 4 years from now, we think we might still have the same basic platform. So if that's the case, the rules have already been published, so you can look at them. Having said all of that, until the government of Ontario actually says AAA is a requirement, there's no guarantee that's forthcoming. But food for thought. Another question is just in terms of whose responsibility is all this? Is this the programmer? Is this the designer? Or is it the person that's updating our website? I don't know, Vanessa. I think all of the above, right?
Yeah, that's true. It's a team effort for sure. So getting people on your team, whether they're a designer, a programmer, or just a marketer who updates content, getting everyone some basic level of understanding will go a long way. I think as we broke it down, there are certain parts that are more geared to what a programmer does versus what a designer will do versus what a content marketer will do. But I think all 3 areas definitely run in tandem. I don't know, Chris, is there anything to add to that?
Yeah, no, I mean, there are also firms that have popped up. I mean, I think, there are a couple in Canada. There's certainly some in the US that have monitoring systems that can enable you to kind of on a kind of never-ending basis monitor to make sure that you have continued compliance on a site. So, I mean, I think maybe that in and of itself is a bit of an indication that, yeah, like anybody that's touching the site, anybody that's making updates to the site, even if it's content updates, I think that they should have some level of understanding of these rules, because the responsibility does kind of lie with anybody that's changing anything on the site. And I think the other thing is just, when you go about making design changes, I mean, I think that's the one where a lot of the design kind of element, you would think things would be further ahead than they are. I mean, I think we see a number of websites that are popping up these days that are brand new sites where you can clearly see that some of the rules are being broken. So I think it's really important that when you do, get a designer involved, I would ask them the question, right? Make sure that they have some understanding of what is and is not okay from a WCAG perspective. So maybe one other question, where can we get more details on all of this? Is kind of maybe a fitting final question on this. Maybe Vanessa, you want to take that?
Yeah. So a really good place to start is the Government of Ontario website, because it does walk through what's required, some of the important deadline dates, and it also links out to a bunch of resources that we have touched on. So there is links to WCAG 2.0 level AA, which is a very big, long list of the rules. Definitely, take a drink, sit down, have some snacks if you're going to go through that, because it'll take some time.
Yeah, I think it's about 40 pages.
Yeah.
But but all the detail is there, right? If
Yeah.
you're so inclined, it is all there.
Yeah, and same thing too, it'll link out to a checker so you can take a look at where your website compliance is currently at. And it also just has some general update info as time goes on, and they have more information to release about anything that should be changed on websites as it comes up.
Okay. So there are a couple other questions, but maybe what will, you know, there maybe ones that are a little bit more specific to individuals. So we certainly can send some notes out to people afterwards. As I said, we did record this webinar, so we'll also send all of you a copy of the deck and the webinar, so you can kind of peruse it at your leisure. And yeah, if you have any other questions following this that pop up, feel free to reach out to myself or Vanessa, and we'd be happy to answer those questions. So thank you everybody for joining today, and hope you have a wonderful rest of the week.
Great. Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.